Hi guys, what's up? This is Miss Hawkins. In our last video, we talked about the road leading to the Constitutional Convention, and today we're going to tackle the actual Constitutional Convention itself. We are looking at Independence Hall, Philadelphia. It took place in the summer months, May through September of 1787, and there were 55 delegates there. Now, when we think of politicians, we generally just think of people who've spent their whole life in politics, but these delegates were farmers, lawyers, merchants, doctors, and politicians. They weren't just people who were lifelong politicians, they were people from the real world who were very invested in what was going to happen at the Constitutional Convention. George Washington presided over the event, and Benjamin Franklin, who was over 80 at the time, was there to lend a bit of gravitas or sincerity and importance to the event. Now you'll notice that I don't mention anything about women, African Americans, or Native Americans, and that's because they were not included in this. They weren't allowed to vote, and so they were not given any say in what the Constitution was going to look like. So thankfully a lot of that has changed in the past 200 years, but at this time they were not generally even considered to be full citizens of the United States. Now, the Constitutional Convention was closed to the public, and you might think, oh, that's sneaky. They're going to close their doors and talk about things, and nobody from the public is going to have any say in it. But it was actually because they didn't want to have people trying to pretend like they were something they weren't. They wanted the delegates to be able to talk freely and openly and discuss the issues they had with the Constitution without having to put on any airs for any of the citizens or constituents that they might be in front of. So the first thing that happens is Edmund Randolph comes and introduces his Virginia plan. He says, let's not just revise the Articles of the Confederation, let's create a whole new government. And this government plan was written by James Madison, who was also from Virginia. And he was instrumental in getting the Constitutional Convention up and running in the first place. And he took careful notes, and he's the reason why we have as much information as we do about the Constitutional Convention. Months before the convention took place, James Madison studied everything he could get his hands on about different forms of government, and he devised what he thought was a pretty good plan for what the new government should look like. He thought there should be a three-part system. There should be a chief executive, there should be a court system, and there should be a bicameral or two-house legislature. You'll notice that this looks quite similar to what we actually have today. However, there is a difference in the legislature. What he had envisioned for the legislature there was a lower house, and that was elected by the people. And then there was an upper house, and that was elected by the lower house, not the people. And both of these houses were proportional. What's proportional? Proportional is corresponding in size. So when we're talking about that in regards to the legislature, we mean that the number of seats in the House is determined by how many people live in the state, what the population of the state is. So if the population of the state is larger, they would have more representatives in the House. If the population of the state was smaller, like a lot of the northern states like Delaware, Rhode Island, Connecticut, then they wouldn't have it as much representation in the houses. So as you can imagine, the smaller states were not happy with this plan. The larger states, which were largely the southern states, were quite happy with this plan, but the smaller states were like, no, let's figure something else out. So there was another guy named William Patterson who came up with a plan called the New Jersey Plan, and he presented this on June 15th. Now his plan was largely, it was just a revision of the Articles of the Confederation. It only had one house in the legislature with one vote, just like the Articles of Confederation, but Congress could impose taxes, which it could not do under the Articles. Congress could regulate trade, which it could not do under the Articles. and Congress would elect an executive branch of more than one person. So instead of just like a president of the United States, it would be like a committee that was the president of the United States, and that would have split up the power so it wasn't just in the hands of one person. However, on June 19th, 1787, the delegates decided that they would rather try to come up with a whole new plan of government than to try to revise the Articles of Confederation to make them work. And so William Patterson's New Jersey plan was defeated at that point. Oh, so let's talk about Roger Sherman of Connecticut. Roger Sherman was a lawyer from Connecticut, and he was put in charge of a committee by George Washington. George Washington put him in charge of this committee to come up with a plan to help figure out how to make the southern states and the northern states agree on how many houses of legislature there should be and how many seats or votes each state should get. So he came up with the Great Compromise. So what's a compromise? A compromise is an agreement between two or more sides in which each side gives up some of what it wants. So the North and the South both knew they weren't going to get everything they wanted, and so they needed to come up with something where they could both be reasonably happy. So they decided on two houses. The lower house would be proportional by state population, meaning that the number of seats would depend on how many people lived in the state, and that's the House of Representatives that we have today. The upper house had 2 seats per state flat out, and that is the Senate that we have today. When we're talking about senators in Congress, those are the people who live in those are the people who work in the Senate. When we're talking about congressmen or representatives, those are the people who work in the House of Representatives, and those vary by state population, and the senators are 2 for each state. Now, the other part of the compromise that they had to come up with was the 3/5 compromise. Southern states wanted to count their slaves so that they could be used for representation. For the House of Representatives, they wanted to be able to count their slaves as citizens so they could have more seats in the House of Representatives. Now, the northern states said no representation because slaves are property. And they wanted to count them for taxation purposes, but not for representation, meaning that the slave owners would have to pay taxes for their slaves so that the states would have more money, the government would have more money, but they didn't want them to count for representation so that the southern states would get more delegates. It is very important to note right here, and I wrote it bold and underlined and bigger. Neither side ever considered allowing the slaves to vote. The northern states still had prejudices against the African American slaves, not to the extent of the southern states, but they still did not see them as full citizens. In fact, the compromise that they ended up with was that they counted as 3/5 of a person in both taxation and representation. This is obviously not a high point in what we consider the history of the United States, but what it did do was when it was approved on July 16th, it basically broke down the last barrier of fighting between the North and the South over the Constitution. It did allow the Constitution to move forward. However, as I said, not a great moment in our history that we counted a whole section of people as only 3/5 of a person. So yeah, not super awesome. In fact, slavery as a whole, the northern states had banned slave trade within their borders. However, the southern states were too concerned that it would pretty much damage their economy if slaves were freed. So in order to keep the peace, Congress decided to shelve the ban on slavery for 20 years. The northern states would not interfere with slavery for 20 years in the southern states. And then after 20 years, they could revisit the issue in Congress. So they just actually kind of just put a pause button in there when it came to slavery and said, we'll come back and figure this out at a different time, which of course they did. And there was a whole war attached to it, and it was, kind of another terrible time in history. But eventually we did manage to get rid of slavery, just not at this time while we're at the Constitutional Convention. So the Bill of Rights is another thing that was up for discussion. George Mason of Virginia wanted to include a Bill of Rights like they had given to the Northwest Ordinance in order to ensure rights for the citizens of the United States. He was afraid that without the protection of a Bill of Rights, the government would abuse its power and take rights away from its citizens. However, most of the delegates were pretty content that the way that they had written the Constitution, the rights would be protected anyways. And so George Mason's motion was defeated there, and the Bill of Rights was not included initially in the Constitution during the Constitutional Convention. So approval. On September 17, 1787, they gathered in the State Hall in Philadelphia to sign the Constitution. Now, Benjamin Franklin, who I call B. Frank, is quoted as saying, "I consent to this Constitution because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best." And that is a very Benjamin Franklin way of saying, this is pretty good. This will work. I don't think we can do any better right now, and this seems like it could be good. This seems like it could be the best thing that we could write, so I'm going to sign this. And I guess almost everyone else agreed. 3 people refused to sign. Edmund Randolph, who was the one who presented the Virginia plan, did not sign because he was afraid there was not enough checks and balances written into the Constitution, and that one house or power could feasibly pull power away from the other ones, and he was afraid that it would lead to anarchy or monarchy or oligarchy or one of the archies that they didn't want because it wasn't a republic. And George Mason and Elbridge Gerry didn't sign because they didn't include the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. However, the rest of the delegates, 52 of them, signed the Constitution, and it was sent to the different states for approval and ratification. And they decided that when 9 of the 13 states approved, a new government would be born, and they would go ahead with putting the government together as it was outlaid in the Constitution, which we will go over in the next part of the unit. But this is Independence Hall, where the Constitutional Convention took place, and this room with its candles and tables and chairs is where the delegates spent months of their lives trying to figure out how to build a new government. They were wearing the clothes of the late 1700s, which included wool and linens and lots of layers and heavy coats, and the only light was by candle, and there was no air conditioning, and it was hot, and they slaved and sweated away so that they could build a new government. This is, though there were some embarrassing things like the Three-Fifths Compromise, this is an incredible part of history. And the people who were there and hammered out the way that our country would run are people to be admired and to be respected. So, Constitutional Convention, what a time. Thanks for listening, guys.